Right. Well, thank you, everybody. So my name is Brian McCauley. I'm the principal economist here at Digital Catapult. First of all, our apologies, but Arthur Turrell is unable to join us today. He's ill. So that does give us a little bit more leeway. But I know that Viktor has rehearsed his presentation and is down to 15 minutes. So we'll be going to time. But I'm one of the organisers that doesn't have a presentation. But if you just indulge me for a minute or two, just to say why we at Digital Catapult were very keen to be involved in this conference. Now, some of you will sort of know the work that we're doing. We have colleagues here from Bayes, but we're working in the areas of advanced disruptive technology. So if one was talking about catch up, then we seriously are catching up, because if we're trying to demonstrate the impact that we're having, but we can't necessarily classify the technologies and the companies with which we work, it's extremely difficult for us to demonstrate to our sponsors and to government and to others that the impact that we're having. So the work that's being done in terms of sort of text analysis that Anna and Juan mentioned are very important for us to actually be able to define the markets and the sectors within which we work. The other area of work that we do is we are very keen on agent-based modeling, and we do have an agent-based model of innovation, but it's a conceptual model, a toy model. We haven't calibrated it, but it's very much based around this idea of combinatorial evolution of technologies. So we built this model around using Brian Arthur's nature of technology ideas, and this allows us to explore the potential impacts that the interventions that we have in terms of de-risking innovation, the knowledge exchange, bringing companies together to reduce the costs, and we're using that to explore what the impacts of our interventions might be. So the topics covered here today have been very, very much part of the work that we're aiming to do, and we're very happy that everybody's been here and the presentation we've had. So I've sort on, and I'd like to introduce Caroline. There we go. So Caroline Paunov from the OECD. Long-standing friend of the Digital Catapult. I've been here a few times, so I'd like to invite you to take the stage. Are you going to stick to 15 minutes?
I'm realizing as the more like we advance in time, the thread becomes less. Now it's like now it's an invite. Before it was like a. So makes a lot of sense. So thanks a lot to everybody, like so many inspiring, interesting things I picked up today. It's definitely a fascinating field here. So I want to take a bit of a step back, because like the role I have, and I'm looking after a working party that involves like OECD and non-OECD member countries and people who are doing policy, and they do innovation policy. And it's our role has been like, well, figuring out what's happening in other countries, what they're doing, where's best practice, and also kind of providing some type of evidence, which traditionally have been a set of well-known standardized indicators like R&D. You'll know some of these OECD manuals. So it's been traditionally be around a lot of this, and a lot of the discussions on innovation has been around R&D intensity, around some of those kinds of traditional factors, or TFP. We have done a lot on patenting as well. So patenting seemed to stay in fashion over time, so that's good. But clearly going in a different way. And so what I want to talk about is a bit more like thinking about, well, how do we use some of that for policy? So we've heard lots of fascinating applications, etc. But what is in there for the policy field? What are some of the opportunities? Well, you've seen a lot of those, so I'll be short on that. But what are some of the limitation when it comes to using them to take decisions over what you spend on what, which is then quite a task further up the line. And then also what is maybe needed for policymakers to use some of this much more than what they do today. So that these two parts. So in terms of the challenging, so some of you mentioned that to me, and I've actually just come back from, I've just came directly here from Germany, where we launched an innovation policy review. So we were basically providing a set of recommendations to the German government on how to deal with things. And I'm not going to go and tell you anything about what's inside. I'm just going to have you focus on the cover, which spent a fair amount of time on, to understand how the complexity on this cover, how the complexity of what we talk about when we talk about innovation policy has changed. So there's a number of clouds. So it's not complex times. We've gone through COVID. Now there's an energy crisis. So there's plenty of things there on the horizon. Things we thought were predictable no longer are. There's things about the energy transitions that you want to be thinking about. There's something called digital transformations that are affecting not just some remote software sector over there, but affecting some of the core industries in Germany, like the automotive sector, etc. So you have transitions, and so there's a number of things that mean that the whole package of what you ask innovation policy to do these days has gone up a couple of dimensions. In the past, it used to be, well, it's something about competition policy and getting things right for SMEs and making them be motivated and getting some finance in place. But it wasn't about all this societal thing about, well, how do we get out of respective crises of different sorts? How do we deal with energy transitions? How do we deal with change that is much more dramatic and that can happen from one moment to the other? So there's clearly a lot more here in terms of what is being asked. But yet when we look at what we study at is a bit like this. So we have a few indicators. So this is R&D intensity and a few other things, the things we see. And then there's all this thing in the dark that we kind of make some assumptions about, or that we think we know, or that we don't even look at. So we have this kind of focused view, which in this case, you can take it in many dimensions. So you don't know what's really going on. You have some idea. You're basing yourself in an exaggerated way on a number of indicators people have taught you for years. Yes, it is.
Right.
No, it's the sad reality of our knowledge. My slides are still operating. Don't worry. It's going to get, with all the new data, it's going to get like shinier. So wait for me to build it up. But there's a lot of, so there's a lot of the things you can then do when it comes to semantics, and focusing on that in particular is to think about, you have all this additional information. You have text information about policies, about developments, about society. So you have a lot of other information that up to now we haven't really been exploiting in any possible ways. And what is that relevant for? Well, that can be relevant potentially when you think about setting some priorities. So where should things be going? What do you want to emphasize when it comes to thinking about trends? We've seen examples of this today, and also, and especially like really responding to things as they happen. So one of the things we're advising to the German government as well, you need to be a bit more agile, need to take a bit more risks. But then if you want to be more agile and take more risks, you need to know what is working, what is not working, what are the impacts. And you need to know that when you're trying it out, and not like 10 years later when you finished some evaluation process that will tell you something about the impact. So it's a lot about, I think the potential is clear, and all of the different examples you've seen have illustrated this further. So then one of the things we've been doing is very simple topic modeling around some of the strategies and some of the information we have, because what countries then come to us to ask is like, well, what is country X doing, or what is country Z doing? And then usually it's down to the colleague X who knows that country to compare it to some other country, and then you're not quite sure how much of it is really the country and how much is your own perception of that country or your own biases. So looking into some of those in a fairly simple way at this point is useful as a first step. I wouldn't say it kind of gives you the full. I'm not going to go into the detail of that. If you're interested, send you more on this, but it's just trying to understand what are some of the policy plans. So that's all the good news. Now let me talk a bit about the bad news, or some of the challenges that we still have. And that is from a perspective of then using this information. So you figured out that some policy change was being taken place, or you've done some analysis. But the first thing is that text data is complicated. So you don't, when you pick up some data like an R&D statistic, you kind of, well, you agreed on a definition, you gathered the data, and this is what the data tells you. This is the amount of spending. Then there's a lot of discussions around that too. But there's much more discussion about any type of statement you find in a policy document, any type of statement. You can mean different things in different sentences, and language is incredibly complex. It depends on what you say when. Things you put on a website might not correspond to what you actually do. So there's a lot of things, and the same terms you use might mean something completely different. So it's not like you just take the text, do some analysis, and then you are kind of happy and this is covered X, whatever that is. Some of the things we are struggling with is that, well, we have big data, but it's not that big. So then you end up, so if you don't want to go and use the patent data, the forever famous patent data that always served in the past and serve now, then you're down to big data, but not big enough data for doing a lot of the fancy stuff that will kind of back things up. So how do you deal with some of these things in a clever way? Then what we want to do is cross-country. But then as soon as you do cross-country, like, well, yeah, it's not standardized, it's not kind of the same thing. So you're kind of going back to, okay. And countries write things differently. So you have wordy countries, and you have countries who promise a lot, and there are countries who are kind of a bit more on the conservative side. And so then try and put this together and do a comparison. It's not as straightforward. No, there's ways around it, but still, it's not like you do the simple tools and you're done. And you're getting into another thing, which is obvious, but text is not action. So you write a lot of things. It doesn't mean that this is actually what you're doing, whether it's on your website or whether it is on in your documents or anywhere else. But what we actually want to do is what you do. So it doesn't really reveal everything, and you need to be careful how it is also being captured. And then a final point is representativeness, which I think is real. It's really hard. So if you're gonna go on Twitter and figure out what people thought about X, and you say, oh, positive attitude towards this or that, I'm not quite sure, because you capture, what about all these people who don't use Twitter? What about, it's the same for some of these databases that then show you something, but do they show you something? Are they really representative of the of businesses in the country? Are they really, are you going to use them as a basis for your decision making? And that's like such a fundamental thing, but it's not quite clear we're there yet. So there's a number of things there which are a bit worrying. Then when it comes to the analysis, one of the things is like, yes, there's something that the data or the data analysis would do, but in many cases, it's not that the data speak for themselves. There's a lot of human intervention and molding, folding, I don't know, like there's a lot of how you call things, how you intervene in the process. That's it happens in all kinds of analysis, but if it's a new analysis and you're kind of just putting out something and it's not being justified, it's then hard to use it because, well, what is it coming from? And another challenge is that we have evolving techniques, and the latest is always the better and the best one, etc. But then if you have founded your decision on something which is now an outdated technique, then it's challenging to keep up to it if you want to then be justifying why you have used that method and why you're basing things on that. And then a final thing, and that's what I want to talk about next, is the question about capacity. What capacities do you have across the public sector? And here I'm not talking only about the very dedicated places, but more generally about those who are applying policies across these different fields. Do we have to use some of this? And so what is then needed? So here is a completely unrepresentative, just as a type of survey we did. But one thing we did was to have, well, we've done a number of those. What are some of the innovations in innovation policy? So we've done a little event. At this point, it had to all be virtual, as you will know. And so we had our policy community there, where 50% were declaring themselves as a complete newcomers to this type of a field. And when we asked them, well, what do you think it would be relevant for these tools? What they were down to saying is, well, let's think about it for intelligence gathering. Let's have it at stage one, just the capturing information and knowing more, not trying to already use it for some other types of applications. Now, when we had some conversations, this is just a side note on the side, is like, well, we were not. Did we succeed in convincing the policy community at that particular event that it was more, that there were some tools that were ready to take and apply? It was, I don't know, I think it was a moderate success, but we kind of, yes. Yes, so I think we failed, but we keep trying. But just a general thing, and that was one of the things that came out, is what I call the dog food challenge. It's like one of them and one of the participants reflected on their own country's background. And they were saying, well, one of the challenges is that some of the policy making is using kind of old tools, like 10 and 20-year-old tools that are for all the reasons I outlined before, that at least they are established, they are accepted, they are working, they're operating, they're easy to follow. Whereas some of those in marketing industries will probably use a completely different set of tools that is miles different, that is kind of at distances from some of what is used in what are critical decisions that are affecting everybody's lives. So it's not like not that I don't care about the dogs and the dog food. I mean, that's important too, but probably you want to be thinking about it broader. So then some of the things that we also discovered is that some of the, when we look at some of the analysis, and there's been a lot of fascinating analysis here, is that the data, if the data doesn't speak for itself, some of the expert community also can benefit from the policy community, because some of the analysis that don't really fit what our policy community want to do. And so what we've started doing is a number of hackathons where we ask the policy community to ask questions, whatever questions they have, come up with what they have in mind, and then team them up with a group of experts, students from different institutions. And it's quite a global phenomenon, quite a fascinating thing to see all this like policy interest in actually doing some of this and applying some of this to try and have more of a dialogue, bringing things together and having a bit more of because this is how you're doing things, and this is why you are doing certain things. Because I think it's important to understand also a bit better what this process is. It's not like, oh, there's this obscure thing called the data science that produces something and here, take it. I think it's more trying to elaborate it together so that some of the experimentations we've been doing on our side. And I think I'm close to the final time I had for this, but just a few things that are also interesting to think about is thinking about guidelines for using some of this. There's a lot of ways on how we know about established techniques, but here, like thinking about the do's and don'ts, what can you take out of a graph and what can you not take out of a graph? Just we've done like little, just what is it also that comes actually from the data, and what is it that comes from the researcher or the analyst in place, and how should you interpret certain things? Definitely important. There's a question about capacities. So how can you find good ways of leveraging some capacities that will be in industry, and that's in the private sector. And there's a question about infrastructure. And so one of the issues that came up, and this is like, would there be a need for CERN, for AI, some stage to address some of these global issues? I think CERN was mentioned before in a completely different context, but there was a question there about like capacities and capacity constraints that clearly becomes an issue in some of this here. So I think I nearly am within my, oh, that's very kind. Thanks so much. I'll just use it to wrap up. So I think we've had what I started with, and it's important, is like the demands on what innovation policy should and shouldn't do have risen quite dramatically. There's quite a lot of demands for steering, directing, looking into responding to crises, being experimental, being agile, etc., where really you need these tools and you need these types of, you need to exploit all information that's available, and you should use all of the tools. Then, as we all know, it's still not so. It's not like you have off-the-shelf NLP that you can just use. There's still a lot of issues that we haven't quite dealt with. I think we're still exploring in many different ways. So I think there's some parts here. There's questions about capacities and how can they be improved, and how can they be improved really not just the capacity to do it, but also to interpret, to read, to use this type of information. I think I think you said it, like, okay, if it's too new, you prefer to just stay away from it. So I think you need something that looks kind of familiar to you in some kind or other ways. And there's questions then about guidelines. Can we establish guidelines, and can we think about building infrastructures or access to infrastructures that can really be more widely used in this type of exercise? And with that, I finish.
Thanks. A lot of food for thought, especially like, I mean, I need to reveal, so I work at the Bank of England, but I only speak for myself, of course. I think developing for kind of, say, data science capacities or analytical capacities or capacities for innovation in the public sector, I think is a great challenge or question. And I want to ask, like, because I see a lot of friction there myself, and I guess I think colleagues from the public sector can subscribe to this, is what do you think are the do's and don'ts, or like good ways, an example, how do you get innovation in the public sector going? I mean, because they're completely different incentive structures.
Yeah.
And I mean, of course, funding and whatever. So just like any views on those.
Yeah, so that's a large question, but I have the benefit of having done an innovation review in Germany, where there's one of these things that we have been thinking about. It's like, how can you generally be more, how can you get policy to be more experimental? And what we had actually been saying is that you should be thinking about developing something like a lab, an experimental lab, where you actually encourage some of this. You have a different context on where this is taking place. You allow for different conditions, and you champion the type of, you have to kind of find a way of championing it, because, and for good reasons, a lot of the administration is built for, I mean, it's more like trying to be on the safe side. You don't want to take risk. You have a responsibility over public budgets. So it's not like if you get it wrong, you don't want to be, there's good reasons why things are more conservative in the public administrations. So then if you want to change things, you probably want to think about things like getting really lab type of conditions somewhere and championing it and saying, we need this type of thing. And so we reward and providing incentive structures for this type of initiative. It's not like this is going to solve everything, but at least you're going to create a different type of context there, and more generally for doing some of this. If you don't do that, then there's always the easy fallback position to, but these are the things that are safer, that we've used before, and that work fine. And then the other is about capacities, of course. If you don't know how this works, also then you probably shouldn't be using any of this. I mean, also if you really have no clue on how to use it, etc. So there's also something about really training and courses, etc. And I think even doing some of it, I would argue you even need to do some of it, even if at a basic level, to be able to understand it.
Okay, we have a question from Niels Handler, who's watching live stream. Excuse me, I've got the cough now. Can the work of the Innovation Growth Lab, for example, Innovation RCTs, I'm reading this out, be applied to illuminate the data darkness, i.e. the apparent lack of rigorous empirical evidence in Germany? That's Niels' words, not mine.
Well, I think there's many, there's clearly a lot out there. Yeah, that was my argument, to say there's a lot out there to go beyond. And I think it's clearly out there, but there's a lot of barriers to doing it, including like data. I mean, we haven't discussed this at all today at any point, like data security, data, like the possibility to transfer data, to analyze it. I mean, there's a lot of barriers to. There's also lots of reasons why you will not be sharing data, good and non so good reasons for doing that, etc., to do that exploitation.
The methodologies in terms of, say, RCTs.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, RCTs always, whenever you discuss this in several countries' context, you're going to have the argument that, but then you are kind of being unfair, or you can't justify using RCTs because you are explicitly leaving somebody who could be getting your support out. So there's a lot of reservations there around. No, that you do it in a different way, but you make sure that those who get it deserved it more, in which case you're kind of defeating the purpose of your RCT. So I think you get a lot of that resistance in the innovation field, which I find funny because you don't get it so much in some of the other fields, including some of the social fields, where you would think that's maybe scarier even, right? I don't get some support and somebody else does. But in the innovation field, there's more of a resistance generally to applying them as a method. But yeah, no, I agree. Fabulous.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very, very interesting talk. So you've outlined quite some challenges, and I was wondering whether you could maybe speak a bit more about, here you have on the slides, you have it on the demands for innovation policy. So which questions do you think are then most fruitful to answer for for us in the science and technology community? So like, what would you want most from this scientific field to be useful for policy?
Oh wow, that's it's a lot. I have a long catalog of things that I think would be interesting to put out there. But one thing that would be quite nice if we could find a way of just understanding what different countries are doing in this field, but not in such a way that you get this like. But right now we have a survey and we get to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages into all kinds of things, and I mean, you can read it online, etc., but classifying it in such a way that it makes sense and that it evolves over time and that it automatically updates itself. Right? You go to the pages, you source the information, and you have this depository where you really know what's going on, and you have ways of weighting it. And there's lots of challenges with that, but that would be an interesting thing. The other thing is knowing what's going on in the field. So we have these surveys, and the surveys tell us something about what firms say. But can you really kind of track some of the developments over time? So there's what is actually happening on the innovation field, public attitudes as well, something that we know very little about. There's from time to time some survey like, do you like science? But how do people think about innovation? Or how do they think about the energy transition? So public attitudes towards things and engaging the public as well. I think also I would say it's not just using it for some analysis, but also using it to develop like new tools. I think there's huge room for doing more things, but I think there's an endless amount of things I could cite here that would be nice. But I would say like going also beyond patents. I see a lot on patents, which is nice. It's interesting, but there's a lot more. The world is, I mean, we always keep saying it, and I feel like there's a lot of focus on patent data and patent analytics, which for good reasons, etc. But maybe a few other fields as well, like Twitter, social media. How do people react to things? Can we think about what is the social dialogue with innovation? Can you use it? Some of these other parts are also fascinating, and I see much less of it in the field of innovation, maybe because traditionally it has been focusing on other things. So
okay, thank you very much, and give our thanks to Caroline. So I'd like to welcome Viktor Stojkosi to the stage, and
thanks, Brian, for introducing me. So, okay, perfect. So I will be speaking about the policy implications of economic complexity. So this is actually a joint work at the Center for Collective Learning, where we are applying economic complexity for policy work. So basically, economic complexity is both an active field of research and a set of tools for designing policy interventions in economic development. When we try to apply economic complexity for policy interventions, basically we want to try to answer questions about economic development that are organized around the pronouns what, when, where, and who. But before we delve deep into this 4W framework of economic complexity, let us try to answer why we use economic complexity. Basically, we use economic complexity because knowledge is non-fungible. With this we mean that chunks of knowledge behave as combinations into our economic output, and they kind of act as sort of ingredients, and what we include in our inputs will determine the flavor of our final output. That is one, for example, if I owned a bakery and I wanted to, one of my bakers quit, and if I wanted to try to substitute them with a surgeon, that would probably won't work. So economic complexity leverages this information and involves the use of machine learning and network science technique to analyze and study the structure of economic output. Economic complexity methods are organized around two types of measures of complexity and measures of relatedness. Measures of complexity summarize specialization matrices between locations and activities into single indicators for competitiveness. These measures are important because they explain the inclusive green growth, that is, locations which are more complex also have higher levels of economic growth, lower income inequality, and lower emission intensity. Measures of relatedness, in contrast, quantify the affinity between a location to a certain activity. For example, how close is London to developing specialization in the automotive industry that we say here. These measures kind of quantify what is the associated risk to developing future specialization, and if we already have that specialization, what is the risk to keep that specialization in the future. So if we are more related to a certain industry, then we have higher chances to develop that specialization in the future if we currently don't have it, and if we have it, we have higher chances to not lose it in the future. Today, these methods have been applied all around the world. As an evidence here, we have the map which shows the reports of economic complexity where have been all around the world. So the reports range from the smart specialization reports in Europe, China special economic zones, Mexico smart diversification strategy, and even reports on upgrading the manufacturing in the United States. But there are so many reports, and we want to try to organize them in a simple framework about how we can apply economic complexity. And we organize them in the so-called 4W framework, that is the what approaches. We try to identify which are the locations in which, the activities in which allocation can develop future specialization. The when approaches, which tell us how our strategy for development specializations develops on our current level of economic development. The where approaches, which tell us how we can leverage economic geography for obtaining new knowledge, and the who approaches, which tell us who are the people that can bring a structural change to a region or location. Let us go one by one and explain these 4 approaches. So first we have the what approaches, which unite measures of relatedness and complexity into a single complexity relatedness diagram and map the activities of allocation into one of the 4 quadrants. In the top right quadrant, we have the high relatedness and high complexity activities of allocation. These are the activities which are of high value for future specialization and which are very related. So we have low risk to develop them in the future. In contrast, on the bottom left quadrant, we have the opposite activities, and these are of low relatedness. So if we want to develop them, we will have high risk of not succeeding. And also these are of low value. So this won't bring much to the competitiveness of allocation. The bottom right quadrant are high relatedness, low complexity activities. And these are activities which are also very related and we have higher chances to develop them, but are of low quality because they are not increasing the complexity of allocation. And the top left quadrant, we have the low relatedness, high complexity activities, which are unrelated. So we have high risk to develop them, but they're of high value for allocation. Let us see how we can apply the what approaches to, for example, the export structure of Shanghai. For Shanghai, in the top right quadrant, we have the high complexity, high relatedness activities, which are mainly machinery, such as manufacturing transfer machines. On the bottom left quadrant, we have animal food as an investment which we wouldn't like to take, and other. For example, here we have processed fish. On the bottom left quadrant, we have neckties or other textiles as other investments, which are also very close to the economy of Shanghai, but are also not profitable for future investments. As a note, these approaches, like the what approaches, describe an inertia, but in most cases, we shouldn't follow that inertia on what to develop next. That is because the relatedness, the shape of the relatedness complexity diagram, basically its slope, depends on the level of economic development or the level of complexity of allocation. For low development locations, we basically cannot use this graph because most of the activities are in the top left quadrant, or they're low related, but are of high value. As complexity or development increases, we get something which has a positive shape, and we can apply the what approaches. So for low developed locations, we will need something else. We will need to invoke the other W's for future development. Let us next look at the when approaches. These when approaches use the complexity and relatedness to try to devise optimal strategies for diversification. So basically, they use the information that as allocation increases its average relatedness, the chance to develop a new specialization also increases. But these approaches also tell us that focusing on the highest relatedness activity, if we want to develop new specializations and increase our relatedness for future, focusing on the highest relatedness activity is only a suboptimal strategy. To explain this, consider a simple example where we have like an activities network, like a product space, research space, or similar, which is something like a wheel network, and we have a random location which tries to develop specialization in all of the activities. It starts with only one of the peripheral activities and tries to move onwards towards developing the whole net. In the top panel, we have when it tries to use the strategy, which are the highest relatedness activities. we can see that it will take a lot of time to reach all of the network. But it appears that if at a certain point in time, we don't use exactly relatedness, but we use something which is unrelated. And at a certain point in time, we try to develop the peripheral node, sorry, the central hub, we will increase our time to, sorry, we will decrease our time to develop specializations. And that is exactly why highest relatedness is a suboptimal strategy. Basically, if we try to use economic complexity, we will see that the fraction of how much we should go into relatedness as a strategy for diversification and unrelatedness depends on our level of economic development. For low development, everything is both distant and close. So we can use just what is relatedness for a certain level of complexity. As we move towards a certain level of development, like in the middle level of development, there is an optimal trade-off between diversified portfolio and an under-diversified portfolio. Whereas as we move again towards the most complex or the most developed economies, we will see that again, everything is close to us and we can just use the relatedness approach. Next, we have the where approaches. These approaches leverage the opportunities which are implied by geographic proximity. It is a widely known fact in economic geography that knowledge diffuses geographically. Like basically, we learn from our neighbors. For example, in the map shown here, we have the map of complexity all around the world. And you can see, I don't know if it's easily seen on the maps from here, but you can see that there are clusters of highly complex economies that are centered in Europe, Northern America, and Eastern Asia. Let us see in more detail, for example, the economy of Mexico, how they have used their proximity to the United States to develop their specialization. The map shown here shows the complexity of Mexico's region. You can notice the stark gradient between the northern regions and the southern regions. Namely, the northern regions are much more complex, have much more knowledge, export much more complex activities than the southern regions. This is because they have become heavily integrated in the economy of the United States. For example, the exports of the northern region of Nuevo León, today it exports electrical equipment and some other intermediate products, whereas the southern regions of Guerrero exports only fruits and some mineral products. Basically, the economy of Mexico has used this proximity to the United States to develop a much more complex structure of exports, ranging from only exporting natural resources such as crude petroleum and silver in the 1990s up to today, exporting cars and even CPUs. Like over 80% of the Mexico's exports are to the United States, so we can see how heavily integrated it is. Lastly, we have the who approaches. These approaches can tell us which are or who are the people that can help us bring new knowledge or unrelated knowledge to a region. They catalyze the efforts by finding people who can bring, like, as we said, new knowledge or setting up an ecosystem for the development of that kind of a new knowledge. For example, Balázs Vengel and his group have found, like in a recent paper, that foreign-owned firms deviate much more from a region's current patterns of specialization. So if we are to undergo unrelated specialization at a certain point in time, we will need to do something which is like attract foreign direct investments. Also, in a very, very recent paper, which we still have not published, is we study how regions in Europe migrants have helped regions in Europe develop specialization. So we found here, we have found that immigrants actually help develop specializations, new specializations in the specializations in which they're specialized, but not only that, they can also help us in developing specializations which are highly related to their own specialization. To summarize, so economic complexity methods have been widely applied all around the world, but they're usually used as a positive descriptors of reality. In research, they have been used only like to study what has happened and how has happened. But we know that policy is mainly normative, and we want to say how a region should develop, how a location should develop. So to help facilitate these applications of economic complexity, that's actually a work of Cesar. Like he developed the 4W framework. And in this 4W framework, we first have the what approaches, which can help us like study which are the closest things and which are the easily accessible, and we can grab those activities for future development. But we cannot always use the what approaches, and at some point we will need to invoke the other approaches. The when approaches help us organize our specialization portfolio into related and unrelated activities. The where approaches invite us to look at our geographical neighbors for possible future specializations, and the who approaches can help us learn like who are the people that can bring the structural upgrade to a location. That was everything. Thank you for your attention. So for anyone who is interested in economic complexity research, our latest working paper is available on the archive. It's about a multidimensional approach to economic complexity. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. Right, we obviously have time for questions. We have about 10 minutes before coffee break. So any questions in the room? Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Very interesting, of course, Victor. So I guess this is a bit of a comment, but I'll try not to make it a rant. So, what's always struck me about kind of complexity and systems approaches to innovation is, so how should we think about this in the context of the market failure approach, right? So the market failure approach to innovation, which is sort of the tradition I tend to work in, right? That's a tradition about, for example, okay, there's a wedge between private and social returns, therefore we either subsidize like public R&D, or that's a rationale for building a tax credit, right? Yes. And we've got sort of now well-developed methodologies for evaluating that or measuring that. And similarly, the market failure approach would tell us about market concentration innovation, right? What market failure, and that's where we've got market failure, right? That does its job, right? And that's something complexity can't do. Well, can't do as well, right? We've got these tools, market failure, which tell us how to build the optimal R&D subsidy or the optimal tax credit, right? But then on the other hand, market failure can't tell us which node to intervene in, right? Within the economy, right? And then I'm thinking, but one area which would be an interesting sort of horse race would be explaining the success of VC investments, which we know is skewed and Pareto distributed, right? And that's where I think your framework of relatedness, so you're mapping the structural economy, that could help us explain this. And we can run a horse race between some sort of neoclassical investment framework and something based on complexity. All right, I'll end the rant.
Yeah, that's like the thing is, economic complexity, like the relatedness framework cannot be thought of like it's something which is causal, which is usually in the classical economics. The relatedness framework kind of acts like propensity scores, so they can tell us something like what we should do, but they don't tell us like why something is related or things like that, or that has evolved over time.
Can I just add a little point there? So I began this session by saying that obviously much of the talk and that around here is very related to what we do here at Digital Catapult. So just to counter your point there, I actually have two papers in relation to the justification for the existence of the Catapult. One is a market failure framework, which I present to my Treasury colleagues to justify and tick that box. I then have my systems failure paper, which basically relates the role of the Catapult in terms of systems failures as opposed to the rather more rigid allocative market failure criteria. And actually gave a lecture here a couple of weeks ago on what we would call the sort of knowledge problem. So big up Jason Potts in the Innovation Commons, but around about how this sort of area about innovation may actually arise even before we get to the entrepreneurial stage. So that was just my little response to you there. So, and so I'll just take this question here from Niels again. How can economic complexity inform Mazzucato type mission-driven innovation policies?
Well, basically with this 4W. So basically that is the motivation, like economic complexity, the application of economic complexity, and these 4Ws frameworks are mission oriented. They tell us what to do, when to do, where to do. All of the application of economic complexity is mission oriented. It's not like, it's sometimes like when we are highly related, we can do something like an exploitation of what we had, but of course it's starting like it's mission oriented towards increasing economic growth, decreasing emission intensity, decreasing income inequality, and that's it.
Thank you. This question here,
Yes.
just for the audience on live stream.
Thank you for this. Is there a space for a how in this framework? Because we have what, when, where, who, but how about how?
Well, what would be the how economic complexity helps us in policy? Or yes, the thing is, of course, the 4Ws tell us how we should do it, like when, where, but of course we can go into more details. For example, when we try to do Mexico, when we are doing Mexico, like the analysis for Mexico, and we are trying like where we need to go deeper into the details, like, okay, Mexico wants to develop in the future, I don't know, we already have cars, CPUs, I know, other electrical equipment. Well, how to do that, we can definitely like look with from where they can learn that, like whether USA can help them learn them, whether they can build an infrastructure for, I don't know, attracting foreign direct investments and that kind of stuff. So that's how we are applying.
Thank you. Warren?
Thank you, Victor. It's great to see that we're starting to have this policy experimentation around economic complexity, and governments are starting to use it to inform decisions. I guess I had two questions around that, which maybe connect with how.
Yeah.
The first one is, what levers are they using? Because I guess if you want to do this, you decide I want to target this sector because it's related, but it's also going to increase my complexity. Then you need to I guess, identify what policies are you going to put in place in order to support this sector. And also, if you're going to be supporting companies at the firm level, then you're going to get into the complex challenge of finding what companies to focus on and getting into the risk of picking winners and things like that. So that's question one around the levers and maybe policy targeting. And then the second question is, are these policies being evaluated? Because I think it would be great to generate evidence about the impact that they can have, and that would definitely perhaps encourage their further adoption if they are found to be successful.
Yes, first, like how we can apply levers. Again, I will use like the where approaches. Like here, like the papers on China have been using like how China has developed in the future, and they have been using where the approaches, and even like combining it with who. For like, for example, like their development of the railroad, like that is one thing that can help like the where approaches, like bringing foreign direct firms, or who approaches that can develop, like bring new knowledge, structural knowledge to the region, attract new people. So that is like one of the levers that can be used. But there are also other examples, like for unrelated diversification. Basically, for related diversification, we don't need any levers because it's an inertia, it happens over. But for the unrelated diversification, we need like the where and who. And one example is that like building railroads towards the locations that are geographically proximal, so we can bring something like that. So that is like a definite example. So regarding the second question, like the being graded and everything, I think so. So I would say like Pierre-Alex Aban knows much more because he has been applying this for the European Commission, right? For example, and there they have like internal and external grades and how they have been developed. So as far as I'm concerned, I have not seen actually a grade like, okay, we have been applying economic complexity and how that has resulted. But the thing is, like, usually that is, well, from talks with other people, it's mainly political, like, for example, economic complexity in Chile was introduced by the left side of the government, in Brazil by the right side of the government, and they have different experience from applying economic complexity. So yeah, I guess it's both like of not strictly following and like how you're following to the end. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're now time. So I'll express our thanks to Viktor for great.